Good evening to you all. I'm Keme Nzerem, and welcome from the Ethical Journalism Network to the first of a series of panels that we hope will start a dialogue around the impact of structural racism in UK newsrooms, on journalists, on us, and on coverage. The panels are part of a project that we're working on at the EJN, which is funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And we're going to be looking into the main barriers to inclusivity, to equity, which is really important, and of course, representation at all levels, from entry to senior editorial across British newsrooms. And the starting point for today's panel, other panels will be different. Well, it's the year since the murder of George Floyd, and we'll be looking at whether anything has really changed in our coverage since then. The wider project, through a number of pieces of research, will try and identify the challenges that journalists of colour face and how this impacts the development of what you might call a more accountable news content that could actually work to overcome systematic racism in journalism, in society. So we hope to be in communication with lots of you in the coming months for interviews, in-depth interviews as part of our research. Just to give you some background on what we do at the EJN before we start. Well, the EJN, the Ethical Journalism Network, it's a global network of journalists and media practitioners and academics and many, many others who are interested in what you might call an ethical journalism and an ethical media. And we've worked around the world to develop tools and resources that try and support, rather than preach at, but support journalists to be more ethical in our trade. For example, tackling hate speech, what to do about disinformation, which we all know is such a big challenge for all of us at the moment, how to tell truth from fiction, given that we are in the truth game. We're excited that this project on structural racism and this panel, it's our first really significant intervention into the UK news arena. And we really hope that the findings from our research will help senior editors, will help management, will help publishers listen to our stories, listen to what we're saying, and contribute to our newsrooms being more equal, being more inclusive, which of course should make for better journalism. I chair today as a trustee of the EJN, as a filmmaker and a former staff correspondent and presenter at Channel 4 News, where I still work as a freelancer. Without further ado, I want to introduce our brilliant panelists who are joining us tonight. Marverine Cole is an award-winning journalist, a broadcaster and an academic. She's worked everywhere, a presenter for Sky News, Channel 5, ITV and the Beeb. And what's really interesting, she's currently the director of undergraduate journalism at Birmingham City University. She is teaching the journalists of tomorrow. Ian Burrell is an award-winning journalist with 25 years of experience at The Independent as assistant editor and also as media editor. So he is very, very, very essential to today's discussion. He understands the industry inside out. He also writes a weekly column still for the iPaper on the media sector, works for Bloomberg, The Insider, The Drum, and has written for many, many other publications. Lebo De Secco, I'm sure many of you will recognize because you'll have seen her reporting recently. She's a correspondent for the BBC. And while in the States, she covered, of course, the Derek Chauvin murder trial from Minneapolis. She was live when that murder verdict was read out. She was also the only BBC correspondent inside the Capitol buildings during the insurrection on January the 6th, reporting live whilst on lockdown in the complex. Imagine how difficult that was. Lebo was born in South Africa, and she's also the daughter of anti-apartheid activists who ended up having to go into political exile in the UK. And Nazia Parveen is a community affairs correspondent at The Guardian, which is it's a kind of newish role, actually, which obviously focuses on reporting on social, political, economic experiences of all of the diverse communities of the UK, but with a particular focus on Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities. She joined The Guardian in 2016, I believe, as North of England correspondent. Prior to that, the Daily Mail's Northwest correspondent. So really interesting seeing the kind of print media from very different sides of the kind of political spectrum, if you like. Also recently named Journalist of the Year at the Asian Media Awards. So welcome to you all. There will be time for questions from our guests, the crowd. Please send them to the group chat in Zoom. They will be moderated and they will be sent to me, and I will try and get to them. We've got about an hour for this, so I'm going to try and get to questions for about 7:15. But no further ado, let's get on with the panel and the topic here. And I want to start with Lebo, given what you were doing recently, the reporting on the George Floyd Derek Chauvin murder trial. And if today's topic is about what has changed since George Floyd was murdered and all the soul searching that many parts of society have done, Lebo's recently back from the States, so she's had a stint reporting there, now back in the UK again. Lebo, what do you think has changed in terms of the way stories about, or the stories that include race or identity, have they changed insofar as the way that bosses, that commissioners treat them? Is there a different appetite, different understanding, a different hunger for them at all?
I don't know. I think certainly in the UK, I don't think that it really has. I think that there was a lot of soul searching and a lot of talking the big talk at the time. But yeah, I mean, I think if you just compare representation on screen in America versus here, I think in America they're led much more by commercial decisions. So for them, they see it as a competitive, something that gives them a competitive advantage to have lots of different races, ages, whatever. Diversity on screen is something that helps them, make money. I think in the UK, we still have this attitude that it's sort of a favor to Black or brown or, whoever, including them, when actually it's about how you best serve the audience. I think that only really changes when you have different people in decision-making positions. And I think that's really the challenge. I'm not quite sure how far we are with that. And I feel bad to start with such a not hopeful message.
But yeah, so that's an interesting reflection in a sense on representation and who we might see or not see delivering the news. But I'm curious about the kind of power behind and story selection, if you like, and how that impacts how stories are actually covered. So I wonder, Nazia, I mean, in a sense that the big news story of today, white working class boys being failed by the education sector, given what we know now, how do you think structural racism, whether it exists or not in the media, is affecting the way that we cover a story when politics and race collide?
So I'm just gonna go back a bit to what Lebo was just saying, and she has a much broader experience than me with being in the States. But my role was created as a result of BLM and George Floyd, and it was in response to that. So my whole job was in response, to what happened with George Floyd. So in that sense, and I know I'm just talking about The Guardian here, I do feel like there has been a definite move towards, focusing on stories involving race, and not just a move, there's been a wholesale change in the way that we cover it. And it's not necessarily just fallen to me. Our whole reporting team are now always looking out for making sure that they're covering those angles. So it has totally changed the way we report. And then going back to the story that you mentioned today, the amount of stories of this ilk that I have covered since I've started this role is, it's staggering, really. So for me, and we were talking about this before we started the panel today, but it came as no surprise, this report by the Education Committee, which focuses on white privilege. And the way it focuses on white privilege, sort of, it's just ludicrous, really. It feels like they are conflating two completely different issues and sort of saying that, sort of disregarding the fact that colour can be an obstacle, like the colour of a child can be an obstacle to them. Sorry, I think I've sort of gone round and round it again, but I think I got to what I was trying to say.
And obviously you're working for The Guardian and you have experience working for a newspaper with a very, very different social outlook. And I'm conscious of you not asking you to speak for a previous employer, but do you think your experience in one newsroom is significantly different to others? I recognize that's quite a kind of personal experience story.
So I know that I'm not trying to disregard here the line that the Daily Mail sometimes takes on issues of race, and it's, to put it mildly, it's unsavoury at times. But personally, my personal experience, when I worked for the Daily Mail, I was a general reporter. My main sort of bread and butter was crime stories. And the reason I started working for them is because they sponsored an award called the GG2 Leadership Awards, which was to try and get more journalists of colour into the newsroom. So yeah, and I'm sort of, I'm also not going to apologise for working for the Daily Mail, because it was a great training ground for me. But I can, I understand that people find it very uncomfortable. But what it has done for me is given me an incredibly rounded perspective. And, I'm sort of, not sort of, I'm sort of grateful for having had that experience and worked in a completely different newsroom to the one at The Guardian.
Sure.
But every newsroom has its challenges, and even at The Guardian, what Lebo was saying earlier. Was saying earlier about there not being enough journalists of colour in senior positions.
Yeah,
that's something that I quite keenly feel at The Guardian, and it would definitely inform our reporting even more. I mean, we do well, but we could do better.
Sure. I mean, representation is so important here, isn't it? Who's telling these stories? Ian Burrell, you talk to editors regularly as part of your job and part of the coverage that you produce. And I wonder, we can kind of talk about human resources in a sense later, but I wonder editorially over the last year, and of course, we must bear in mind here the big row with the Society of Editors and the comments that led to the departure of the director. Do you see any change over the last year in terms of what British journalism is doing and what's happening inside UK newsrooms?
I think it's very limited. I think you can point to a few positives. I see a positive in Clive Murray winning the Royal Television Society Journalist of the Year award, albeit that was for COVID coverage, although he did cover the Black Lives Matter campaign as well. We see, as Nazia pointed out, her appointment along with Amna Modine at The Guardian as Community Affairs. That was a positive response by The Guardian to Black Lives Matter. We've seen Nadine White appointed as the first race correspondent at The Independent, coming over from HuffPost. There have been a few things, mostly from the usual suspects. But I think it's all been very much overshadowed by this backlash that we've seen from a large portion of the UK media, which has latched onto these culture wars with relish. And I think for any young student journalist now of colour who's thinking about a career in this sector, I don't think it looks like a particularly welcoming place. Not when you've got so many outlets almost seeing journalists of colour as some kind of statement of woke, this sort of false bogeyman that they keep pushing forward.
One could perhaps even bring into that the title of one of the segments, Woke Watch, on a show that I'm sure we're all familiar with. Look, let's come back to that, because actually you raised something really important, which is the students of the future, something that we should go to Marverine Cole for. Marv, how has what's happened over the last year, how do you see and feel that filtering down to tomorrow's journalists? And do you get a sense that Black and brown journalists are going to find it harder, easier to progress? What's happening?
Gosh, it's really interesting because I've been in academia for about 5 years now. Started off as a visiting lecturer at various universities around the Midlands, and now it's coming up to 3 years where I've been the director of undergrad journalism at Birmingham City University. So we are not the Russell Group, we're not the University of Birmingham, we are BCU, the former Poly Vocational Post 92. So our courses are incredibly practical. But you know, when I started out as a VT, I had students approaching me surprised to see me as a former journalist and as their lecturer, never having had a Black lecturer before. But what a lot of students,
Black female lecturer.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. It was like, whoa. And I was rushed by my Black and Asian and ethnic minority students just going, wow, it's amazing to see you here. We're so excited. But also what a lot of students sought from me was validation for their stories. Is this newsworthy? Right, stories that come from their own experience or from their own communities. They were asking me, is this newsworthy? And I was like, hell yeah, if it stands up to all the other principles of, you know, it's got a person at the heart of the story, it's got, you know, it's got a peg, it's got data, it's got expert comment, and you can tell it well. Yeah. So already, you know, some students are kind of thinking, they're almost policing themselves around the types of stories that they can tell and are allowed to tell. So thankfully, in the spaces that I've taught, I've encouraged students to, you know, always follow those lines, you know, always have the right ingredients for a story. But second to that, even though, you know, I'm very open and my entire team are very open, because you can see it. Journalism doesn't feel very welcoming for people of colour, right? Although me and my team, we put journalists of colour in front of them routinely, whether it's through the mentorship scheme that I run for final year students that I established, whether it's through, you know, when we started our partnership with HuffPost a couple of years ago, our students met Nadine White, met Asmodee, right through this last year, whilst we've been teaching online, we've put in front of them Tobia Reddin, Yahya Mohammed, Rihanna Croxford, Arif Ansari. So we've presented to them journalists of colour, as well as white journalists, right, in the mix to show them you can progress, you can, if you want it. And my final point is, even though it might feel unwelcoming, I've got several news organisations who've come direct to me at Birmingham City University, recognising that we're a university of 26,500 students that reflects the population of Birmingham in that it's something like 48-49% of our student population are Black, Asian and minority ethnic, right? So we have a mixed set of students, a lot of students from the Midlands, majority commute in from the Midlands, West Midlands conurbation into us. And often they are students who are the first in their family to go to university. So these are often our students are the very students that news organisations need in their newsroom. So I have organisations coming to me going, how can we get a work experience scheme running? How can I get an internship running? How can this work?
Yeah.
So it swings and roundabouts.
So bits of the industry say they want change, but I'm going to just want to put something to you briefly, Marv, and then move on. I want to read out the dictionary definition of structural racism, okay? Because we've got bits of the industry saying we want you, yet we know that it is harder for Black and brown journalists to make progress, to get to the top of the ladder, etc. And there are also questions about content and editorial direction. So the definition is laws, rules, or official policies in a society that result in and support a continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on race. Marv, do you think that definition can be applied to our industry?
Yeah, without a doubt. You know, I've experienced it myself in my own career as a journalist. You know, I know for as many jobs that I have been in, I've had various experiences there that have been against me, and I know I've not been considered for roles because of my race. I absolutely know it.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
I just don't think that. I think, you know, if you're wanting to be a journalist and you want to make a change in this industry, I think we have to be in it to put up the fight.
Sure.
If we're going to go down those analogies, right, we have to be in there. We have to be trying to make a change.
So look, we kind of started this session by talking about what we're trying to do. Getting information is part of a wider project, and a lot of this is about trying to filter experience and real newsroom experience. Now, I'm very, very cautious about asking Black and brown journalists to relive potentially traumatic things that have happened to them in their career as a result of their ethnicity. But Marv, you mentioned there that you know that the industry has a structural racism problem because you have experienced it by virtue of perhaps not getting jobs. But look, I just want to go around the table really quickly, and please only share what you feel comfortable with, because I recognize this is not always easy, okay? Lebo, you're a Black woman working in this industry. We will all have seen recently Luquesa's article about finally having the courage to wear her hair naturally and how terrified she was. And I just wondered, did that resonate with you? Are there other experiences that, you know, are not necessarily just structural racism, but real prejudice or discrimination that you feel that you've experienced?
I mean, I'm smiling because I know Luquesa and she's so wonderful. And I read that piece and I've spoken to her a lot about it. But I remember speaking to one of our makeup ladies one time, and my hair was just starting to break. There's so much straightening of it, blah, blah, it was the whole thing. And she was like, she just said, why is it such an issue for you have to have your hair as it grows out of your head? You know, at that period of time, this person has now left, so I feel like I can sort of talk about it, but I remember having to ask permission to have my hair in braids, and the person said to me, how easy would it be to put it back to what we're used to? I know that, you know, I think look, there's the everyday little paper cuts that you get, but I think the most difficult thing is that I think the issue with getting people into the industry is perhaps not the big issue that we don't talk about so much is the support of people once they are inside the industry, because there are so many talented Black journalists across our media landscape. But once you're inside organizations, they want you to come in. Yeah. Once you're inside these organizations, what is done to support you, to help you achieve your goals, to make a plan for you? I'm not saying, I mean, obviously we're all journalists, so it's not, you know, nobody's required, it's not a sense of entitlement, but in the same way as, you know, other people have kind of formal mentorships, or, you know, what is done to support you, and where is the grace, you know, in terms of supporting you or making mistakes or whatever. I remember one boss a while back telling me that they thought that the North Korea nuclear story, like that whole area, was not a specialism, that is general knowledge. So she expects everybody to know this. But when it comes to Africa, a continent of 50 plus countries, that is a specialism, but she doesn't expect her presenters to know about that. It's like,
it's ghettoized information that, exactly. And then that has an impact on you and your sense of what's an important story.
I mean, what I would say, and thinking in terms of what does give me hope and what has helped me, is I think across my career, Black women in particular, but Black people have been my biggest cheerleaders and biggest kind of supporters. When I look at younger people and how, and this is one thing that perhaps has changed since George Floyd's death, younger people coming into the industry were already a bit more outspoken about what they wanted, and also taking what works for them from the industry and then making their own path. But I think now they're just so much more vocal. You know, I feel like a really old person saying that, oh, the young uns are doing it for us. But I think that there's a certain kind of, they don't have to have it. They're not, I guess, in the system in quite the way that we are. For me, the whole George Floyd story hit me in a particular way. And I think that really, I think my journey to America and my, you know, and ending was kind of started and finished with that story. But I remember at the time going to lots of listening sessions and lots of kind of panels and things where Black people were kind of talking about their pain, and then people were saying, oh, but we don't want you to be a token, we don't want you to. And I just, for myself, have decided that I think the most empowering way forward is to look at, rather than how do I convince you to let me at the table, I really at this point am about how do I empower other people of color, other Black people to better eat, to come into the room as well. I've got a friend, a South African journalist, who says, you know, it's not about being in the room by yourself, it's about being in the room, opening the door, helping other people get in. And that's where the power.
And there will be many young girls who have watched you reporting Libu, knowing that they can do it too, right?
I hope so. That is something that I really, when I was particularly working on the Chauvin story, speaking to young Black people was something that was really important to me. Well, Black people of all ages, but when younger people would come up to me and say that they felt they could say things to me that they couldn't say to a white journalist that impacted on the story. So for example, you know, on the day of the verdict, people saying to me, yeah, we're pleased about the verdict, but American justice doesn't work, but we don't feel we can say that to, you know, that other white guy there.
Sure.
Because, you know.
Yeah, look, appearance matters. Nazia, we were kind of talking about this with Marv and Lebo really through the prism of TV and TV journalism. And I wonder to what extent performative appearance, if you like, matters when you're a print journalist. And again, the same caveats, please don't feel that you need to share anything that you feel uncomfortable with, because sometimes this stuff is difficult. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the work that you do and whether, you know, what you've experienced that has not been as savory. Yeah,
I mean, yeah, we're not on the screen, but, you know, just like other journalists, we're working in newsrooms where, speaking to what Lebo said earlier about paper cuts, and there have been, you know, a number of occasions where I've been confused with the only other Asian female journalist in the room, and people, even though we look completely different to each other, people can't seem to differentiate between the two of us, which obviously, you know, especially when you're a younger journalist, you're just like, I'm confused by that. Like, why can't you just figure out who is who? And then since George Floyd, and I'm not going to share the experiences of people in this group, but we've started a Guardian and Observer people of colour group on WhatsApp, and we share experiences on there, and you know, some of those are quite distressing to hear, and a lot of the experiences that have been shared have been about progress and how journalists and other staff in the media industry, in the print media industry, have felt like they have been held back purely because of the colour of their skin and their heritage. And then the other thing, I think this is something that I have found personally, is my class, which has, I felt, really at times hindered me, and especially when I started working, you know, for a broadsheet paper, where I'm a rare thing in that, you know, I didn't go to Oxbridge. I had a very, I'd say, I'd call it normal, you know, other people might describe it as, you know, sort of mediocre education. It was, you know, it wasn't great shakes. And, you know, and I wasn't aware at times of these, like, sort of like soft skills that you learn and the rules of the game. And I think for me, one of the biggest barriers has been class. You know, being able to progress. And there was a program a few years ago that Amal Rajan did about how to break into, you know, elite industries, and we are considered an elite industry. So, you know, if you've got the double whammy of someone like me who's, you know, from a Pakistani background and then a very working class Pakistani background, you know, it makes it quite difficult to navigate that kind of arena.
Sure. And, you know, I'm kind of conscious that I've asked the three people of colour on the panel for their experiences. And of course, we as people of colour, we don't get to hear the conversation when we're not in the room. So Ian, I wondered if you could help us with a bit of insider reflection on the white gaze. What are we all know the conversations that used to happen about people that look like us. When we're not in the room, what kind of stuff do you hear that, you know, just gets bandied? Well, there's no black people here, we can say that kind of stuff. Has it changed? Does it still happen?
Yeah, well, it's not always that there's not someone there to hear it, because then they're not in the room. They're not in the organisation very often. That's certainly the case when I started off. Marverine's talking about the ethnic mix at Birmingham City University. I started my career at Birmingham at the newspapers there, and there were almost no journalists of colour, especially no journalists of colour who represented the communities that we served. The culture reflected that. There was a hostility, a them and us feeling in a city that was already hugely diverse. But in the 1987, I started there. There was a tension there, which spilled over from the Handsworth riots of 81 and 85. You had the picture desk there telling war stories, really, of when they were dodging bottles and bricks from the riots. There was one fairly senior journalist kept a Rasta wig as a sort of amusing theatrical prop in his desk. And when I just started off there was a story which I just picked up from the police calls about a terrible, tragic road accident, which the paper got interested in until I told them that the victim was a young Asian boy, at which point they weren't interested in going after a picture of the family. The story went down the news agenda. And it's not just in those local press arenas, those newsrooms. I was at the Sunday Times at the time of the Stephen Lawrence murder. And if you remember, there was a lot of anger around the far-right BNP, which had its headquarters in Eltham, in southeast London. It's been stoking hatred there, and that was where Stephen was murdered. And the focus of the Sunday Times newsroom at the time was not, as you'd expect, on investigating the BNP and what they were up to, stirring prejudice and hatred. It was to look at Panther UK, which is a black militant group that was involved in the protests. They're a protest group, small group, harmless really. And that sort of approach, that narrative, we still see it, albeit more subtly. We see it in the coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests, where there was a knee-jerk interest in doing down the protests as soon as there was trouble in Downing Street, as soon as a police horse was running without its rider. Focus quickly turned onto that, as it subsequently turned onto things like taking the knee at football matches, and that's how you see it played out. It's not always those comments about individuals. It's this sort of attitude. It's very quick to blame the victim.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm curious about how we now see that manifest. And we talked a little bit earlier about Woke Watch. Ian, as we kind of got you mulling the direction of a lot of coverage these days, how do you see the future in a sense? Culture wars sell for some publishers. How could you say that GB News, for example, how can that be consistent with the equity and inclusion rights and demands of Black and brown journalists? And I recognize that's quite a lofty question. But...
Yeah, well, it's a strange one, really, because they've gone to some lengths to show an element of diversity. And we've talked about the hostility that many young journalists of colour might see in the industry as they contemplate it. But I think if you're a Black or minority ethnic journalist, a journalist of colour, and you have a libertarian or a conservative small C worldview right now, you're probably not short of job offers, because there are a lot of outlets on that side of the political landscape who want to show that they have a breadth of diversity in their newsroom, but are not willing to compromise their ideology, and people who have that kind of position.
And if you don't have a libertarian or small c conservative worldview,
your options are more limited. Yeah, unless we're talking about a few of the usual suspects that we've cited earlier.
And then there's the impact on the national discussion, but that is a very, very big discussion. And I'm conscious that we've got to get to questions from the crowd. I just want to go around all of you very, very briefly. We've talked a lot about experience, nodded a little bit to process and what might make things better. Marv, you're training the journalists of the future. One thing, one idea that employers could do that would help Black and brown journalists be better at their jobs?
Oh my God, that's a question, isn't it? I think I'd alluded to it before around the issue of work experience and internships and getting them into the organisation to see how it works. There's only so much me and my team can do in teaching those journalists, those students, what to do in this situation, but unless they are in the actual situation and having to make the decisions, they're not really going to know. But also I think, erring back on what Ian was saying about attitudes of and workplace culture needs a big kick up the behind, because often when some Black and brown journalists are in newsrooms, if they get something wrong, it's like, they're down on you a ton of bricks, or, oh, you're just a low achiever and that's it, and you're written off and you're not given a second chance. And you can tell by the way I'm getting a bit irate, it's because that's happened to me and I've seen it happen. And I've mentored, aspiring journalists to whom that has happened as well, right? So there needs to be just a bit of humanity around the treatment of Black and brown journalists in newsrooms. Doesn't mean extra special treatment. Sure. Let's have equal treatment of humanity around them and their experiences. And I think that is what's going to help.
And this is so important, Nazia, when you are talking about somebody who hasn't had all the trappings of going through the private school system and Oxbridge and that assurity and entitlement. You enter that workspace and a lot of it is alien. It doesn't mean that you're not a great journalist. You may just be less familiar with how to leverage your own power. So one idea from you, Nazia, what could employers do to help Black and brown journalists be brilliant?
So absolutely, yeah. I mean, the one idea that I heard the other day was to give journalists of colour a sponsor. So it's like a slight step up from a mentor, where they go into meetings with you, and if you're feeling not so confident that day, or not able to know how to structure that email to make sure you get your idea gets bitten by the editor, you've got someone right there who's always advocating for you. And whether that's an older journalist or someone in a more senior position, I think that would really, really help. And then just a really basic idea, I think, that would just really transform newsrooms is to promote journalists of colour, not wholesale promote all journalists of colour, but put them into more senior leadership positions. And that will change the way younger, junior reporters who are coming through, who are not so confident, how they feel and how they feel about sending an email to the editor. If it's somebody who looks like them, it sounds...
If you can see it, you can be it.
Yeah, sort of, yeah. And that sounds really... It's like at school when you've got a teacher who's a teacher of colour. I used to find it more comfortable going to speak to that teacher because I knew that she might have had a similar experience to me. And that's exactly how it works in media, really. So, yeah, so that's two, sorry. But,
two for the price of one. Two for the price of one. Libu, one idea or two.
Well, my ideas are kind of following on from what Marverine said, what Nazia said. Marverine, I know that you do a lot of mentoring, and I don't know, I'm always kind of torn with the idea of sponsorship, because I think, oh, what about the people that don't get it? But I do feel that employers should have structured within every organization, everybody gets a mentor, and that person is the person exactly when you feel stuck in your career, when you want to send that important email, whatever it is, you know, having those monthly check-ins or quarterly or whatever it is. And I can't remember which film director it was, but there was a film director that said that when he went to university, black guy, when he went to university, he didn't realize that, I think he was talking to his roommate that had gone for like lunch around the dean's house, and he didn't know that this was happening. Like there was this whole tier of hanging out with like the management of the university that he didn't know was happening. So as well as that kind of mentoring within the organization, I think it does have to extend to, you know, that barbecue or whatever it is, because I think that when you are invested in a person, when Nazia, I see you, and you're no longer this person that's different from me, and we have a relationship, I will, you know, people promote people who they can see themselves in, and the more there are those relationships around, I think the easier that is. And then for people of color, for Black people and, you know, Asian people, I feel what Americans are very good at doing is networking, like formally. So they have all their sororities, whatever. Of course, there is the slightly elitist thing about it, but journalism is the media, you know, it is about your connections, who you know. And I think that's something that we could, I've always been very British about, like, oh, do you mind if I, and we've just got to get more kind of bold about that, and, you know, say, contact me. Do you know what I mean? Just be ballsy about that and not be made to feel bad about it.
And Ian, do you see any of the structural changes that we've alluded to some degree, be it recruitment or retention or additional, you know, it kind of emboldened line management, if you like? Do you see any of that happening in any newsrooms?
Well, the publishers would say that they are doing things. I mean, you know, we heard a little bit from Nazia about the Daily Mail trying to recruit some more diverse journalists to their newsroom, and the Sun's last batch of apprentices were quite mixed. There were about 7 journalists of colour among about 15 recruits. So demographic changes are making things happen very late in the day. Further up the ladder, as you say, is where there are real problems. Rula Khalaf at the Financial Times, probably the only editor of colour. I worked under Amal Rajan when he was at the Independent as editor before he moved to the BBC, but no one else in the top jobs. What I think needs to happen to change that culture is not just the very top jobs, it's also those key specialist positions. So brave editors that are coming through, take a chance on someone, take a chance on a journalist of colour, point them to science editor, education correspondent, defence editor, investigations editor, some of these key roles within the newsroom that are outside of, say, the more obvious sort of diversity correspondent or those kind of, as we might say, ghettoized roles, and bring people in from the margins, put them at the heart of the news gathering process. And that's how you change the culture of the newsroom. And journalists of colour, you know, hopefully will feel emboldened to apply for those roles. But we still need people to have the courage to appoint them to them.
Thank you very much. We're rapidly heading towards close, so I just want to read a couple of comments and see if anybody wants to respond. First one is the first one refers to the big story, that the big news story today, the white working class education story. So I'm going to read it out, and there is a kind of a question at the end. To me, any reporting of this story feels like a perpetuation of a harmful and distorted version of the truth. As a young journalist of colour, I understand this is news, but how do we tell this story in a progressive way? Many readers might only scroll past the headline on social media, so won't necessarily see interviews criticising the white privilege connection, even if the article does say that in full. And there's an add-on here. Is there a tension between telling all stories and journalists wanting to tell stories from our community in journalism, where journalists are fearful of not wanting to be typecast, seen as the person that can only tell our stories? If so, what can we tell future journalists about fighting to tell all stories, ours or otherwise? I think that's a great one for Nazia, because you've been doing this story and you're the community affairs correspondent. And I'm just going to chip in my own experience here. I was sports correspondent for quite a long time, and lots of people will say to me, oh, black guy sports. Yeah, you know, I used to spend a lot of time trying to get social issue stories into my sports reporting because I didn't want to be the black guy doing sport. You know what I mean? And there, you know, that kind of ghetto thing always did kind of rankle for me at the back of my mind. But anyway, that's enough about me. Nazia, how do we tell these stories without being ghettoized?
Well, I mean, it's a story that we have to tell. It's important that we tell these stories. It's not a situation where we can decide not to tell it, because it's the Commons Education Committee, and
it's a big political story. It's a massive political story.
And what the report is saying, despite the fact that I completely disagree with it and think it's ludicrous, we have to report what it says. But the way to do it is to sort of get the balance and I'm not saying that we're a shining beacon, but last night our education correspondent covered the bones of the report, and then I did an analysis of it. And then today, we spoke to people who were really quite upset about what had been said in the report, and in that we were able to hopefully, present it in a balanced way, and not just sort of, I suppose, regurgitate what the Commons Education Committee had said and just sort of put the facts there, but we were able to get opinions from both sides, which I guess is is what we do. Yeah.
Marv, I'm curious, do students of today, following on from that, is there a sense, because of the rise of kind of opinion news and fake news and disinformation, a younger students finding it hard to distinguish commentary and opinion from old school news journalism and balanced, we tell both sides?
At my university, on my courses and the students I teach, they are, when they come in, when they start on day one. I'm quite hardline, and I'm very proud of being very hardline in the way that I teach journalism. And I help my students understand, my entire team help my students understand the difference between opinion and comment, and what is fact and balance, and having integrity about your reporting, and verifying and fact checking. And I'm very precise about, for particular modules, what they should be delivering, and offering them, examples of, this is exemplary work, read it, analyze it, emulate if you can, and this is what should be in it. So by the time they graduate, they are, in no doubt as to what is opinion, what's fact, what's good news, what's bad news, what's fake news. So they should be ready for the world of journalism.
And add on to that, as a young journalist, how do you balance between not compromising your values? So this is a different issue. This is not about commentary, this is values. How do you balance between not compromising your values for the sake of the organization you're working with?
It's interesting. Again, I teach my students the understanding of the media landscape. What's out there, who does what, you examine the content, come back and give me a feel for how much integrity this news organization has, right? And then ultimately it's their choice. You work for who you want to work for, you go for the internship for whomever you want to go for, but just know these are the headlines that have been published by this organization. This is the backlash, this is the outrage. And then you know what, when you're inside an organization and you're feeling a bit challenged around your values, you ultimately do have to decide, do I want to earn my bread and butter with these people and put values aside to pay my rent? Or do I want to work for an organization, that is trusted by news consumers and, and tells the truth and fights for the truth and fights for social justice and equality?
Ian, I could see you nodding there. What would your advice be to that young journalist going, asking a really legitimate question? I need to eat. I'm a professional journalist. How do I manage this? Oh, we need to unmute you.
Yeah, well, it's a difficult one. But Nazia sort of talked a bit earlier about her own experience at the Daily Mail, for example, which has provided journalists that have gone on to work for many other news organisations. That path between the Daily Mail and the Guardian is quite a well beaten one, and some organisations which or newsrooms that you might be difficult to reconcile your values with have very strong sort of journalistic track records, and you can learn a lot, but I guess you have to weigh each assignment up, and that's the difficult one, how far you push back when you're given a story to do that somehow cuts across your view of the world and your own outlook. You're very vulnerable in that early stage of your career to being compromised in that way. But I think, as Nazia said, she had a generally positive experience and learned from that and progressed in her career. So you don't necessarily write everything off if it's a good first step for you.
And look, from one's employer to finding oneself in a story where you might have to spend close proximity time to people or with people who you may not see eye to eye with. And I'm thinking of that moment on January 6th, Libu. How did you keep your cool?
Well, that actually wasn't, I was quite scared, but we were not in contact with those people at the time. I did spend a lot of time in America speaking to Trump supporters, most of the time, who were quite open with me about, what they felt and why they felt it. I decided I wanted to try and approach them with a kind of sense of curiosity, like trying to understand why they felt what their journey was, what it was about that person that they were into. So, for example, when I was covering the Trump COVID story, talking to some of his supporters outside of the hospital, who told me about how, they'd seen industry disappear and et cetera, et cetera. So, getting those kind of the backstory of what led people to Trump and trying to, my current job is as global religion correspondent, so I do a lot of this anyway, but trying to listen to people that just might have quite different ideas than me with an open mind, as long as they are not violating my own sense of my moral code, really, as long as they're not, spewing racism into my face. Actually, the reason we ended up inside the Capitol building on January 6th, we'd gone to report the counting of the Electoral College votes. We were outside, and we were with one of my colleagues from the Persian network. And he's obviously, a brown man. Mm-hmm. And there was that was the one day that there was a very different atmosphere amongst the Trump supporters. They had already started to build up. And the amount of racist comments spewed at him about, you know, Islam and we don't want you here, that was why we moved inside the building. And then the police came and, you know, told us that we were being locked down and moved us into the tunnels and then finally into the cafeteria. Initially, before, this was like an hour before the Capitol was actually stormed, there was bomb threats. So yeah, it's not as if there weren't times where it was difficult, and it's not as if there weren't times when there was that tension. But on the days when people weren't kind of violating us morally in that kind of way, I tried to listen with a ear to understand where their journey came from.
Libu, that is a very appropriate, I think, story upon which we can close this, because if we're talking about the structural racism that Black and brown journalists have to navigate around inside our industry, then there are many more quite significant threats, real physical potential threats that we experience in the course of our jobs that are in addition and over and above that other journalists may face. So I wanted to thank all of you for contributing, sharing your experiences, some of them deeply personal. I'm grateful for that. I hope it's been useful for everybody listening. And the work that we need to do at the EJN, of course, is to continue this and to really try and produce solid research that helps us understand better what it is to be a minority ethnic journalist in a British newsroom. The experience in the office, the relationships that we have with our commissioning editors and our bosses, and that really, really precious relationship that we all rely on, the relationship with our readers and our viewers in the world, because without them, we have nothing to report on, and that is who we do this for. So, Ian Burrell, Marverine Cole, Lebu Diseko, Nazia Parveen, thank you all very, very much indeed. For all of you watching, there will be more panels, and we really, really hope that you will join us. And this event will be written up and on the website. So we hope to see you soon. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.